Imagine this. You're walking through the streets of ancient Rome. The air smells like incense and sweat. The forum buzzes with politics and gossip, and marble statues of gods tower over beggars and senators alike. Suddenly, you spot the emperor. Himself, Nero. He's not alone. On his arm is a dazzling young woman, wrapped in silks and jewels, turning every head in her path. But there's a secret behind her beauty that freezes you in place. Because everyone in Rome knows, that woman was once a boy named Sporus. And what Nero did to him is one of the most disturbing stories of psychological and physical manipulation in all of history. Stay with me, because this story, it's not about ancient politics or Roman extravagance. It's about how unchecked, power can twist love into obsession and a human life into a living puppet. Let's back up. Before we get to Sporus, we need to talk about the man who started it all, Emperor Nero. Now, Nero didn't begin his reign as a monster. In fact, when he became emperor at just 16, a lot of Romans actually had hope. The early days of his rule looked promising. He cut taxes, threw public festivals, and even performed on stage. Yes, the emperor fancied himself a bit of an artist. To the average Roman, it seemed like the dawn of a golden age. But here's the thing about absolute power. It changes people. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, but it always leaves a mark. And somewhere around the year 65 AD, Nero snapped. Something inside him cracked wide open. Was it the paranoia? I mean, imagine being at the top of an empire of 60 million people, and not a single one can tell you no. You don't have peers. You have subjects. Everyone around you either wants your throne, or wants to stay alive long enough to kiss your ring. Or maybe it was grief. Because if there's one person Nero loved more than his own ego, it was Poppaea Sabina. And Poppaea was electric. She wasn't just beautiful. She was ambitious, intelligent, and confident enough to stand toe-to-toe with a Roman emperor. When Nero met her, he was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, but that marriage was ice cold. It was politics. It was duty. It wasn't love. Poppaea, on the other hand, was fire. Where Octavia was quiet and obedient, Poppaea was bold and dazzling. She didn't hide in the shadows. She demanded the spotlight, and Nero fell hard. Their affair started like many Roman scandals. Whispers, late-night visits, forbidden glances at banquets. But quickly, it turned into something more than lust. Nero didn't just want Poppaea. He needed her. And that's when things got dangerous. Nero's obsession was total. He began showering Poppaea with gifts, expensive ones. Silks from China, perfumes from Arabia, diamonds that could bankrupt a province. He built statues of her, paintings of her, commissioned busts so that even when she wasn't there, she was always watching him. And he began cutting off her world. He removed the people she loved, isolated her, surrounded her with yes-men loyal only to him. This wasn't love. This was possession. Eventually, Nero did the unthinkable. He divorced Octavia and made Poppaea his empress. The wedding was lavish. It was spectacle on top of spectacle. But even marriage didn't soothe Nero's obsession that he kept her close. Too close. And when Poppaea spoke her mind, which she often did, it didn't end well. See, Poppaea wasn't the kind of woman to play silent consort. She had ideas, opinions, a sharp tongue. She mocked Nero's acting. She challenged his decisions. And that independence, the same thing that drew him to her, became unbearable. One day in 65 AD, they had a fight. And no one knows exactly what triggered it. Maybe she called him out for being late after a chariot race. Maybe she mocked one of his songs. But what we do know is this. She was pregnant with Nero's child, and in a fit of rage, he lashed out. Some sources say he kicked her in the stomach. Others say he beat her until she collapsed, bleeding on the marble floor of the palace. Either way, the result was the same. Poppaea died, and with her, Nero's unborn heir. Now here's where the story takes a dark turn, and I mean really dark. Nero didn't just grieve. He unraveled. He refused to cremate her body, which was the Roman custom. Instead, he had her embalmed, entombed like royalty, with all the splendor of a goddess. He declared her divine, made a cult in her honor, and in private, he talked to her corpse. For days, people around him had to play along, had to pretend she was still alive. Her seat at dinner stayed empty, but was always set. Courtiers referred to her in the present tense. If you slipped up, If you said something like, "She was beautiful," instead of "She is beautiful," you were exiled. Or worse, it was around this time, when Nero was deep in grief, denial, and delusion, that Sporus came into the picture. He was about 14 or 15, born into slavery, later freed by the imperial household. He'd grown up within palace walls, trained for administrative duties. That may sound like a decent gig for someone of his background, and in some ways it was. Freedmen serving the emperor had status, housing, even wealth, but they also had zero autonomy. They lived and died at the emperor's whim, and Sporus had something that caught Nero's broken eye. He looked like Poppea, same eyes, same delicate face. The resemblance was so uncanny, some believed it was spiritual, a reincarnation. Nero certainly took it that way, and that was all it took. Nero, Sporus wasn't a person anymore. He was a second chance, a blank canvas on which to recreate the woman he'd lost. There was only one problem. Sporus was male, but Nero? Nero was a man who thought himself a god, and gods don't accept limits. So what does a god king do when the object of his obsession no longer exists? He builds a new one. Nero didn't just ask Sporus to dress like Poppea. He ordered a full transformation. This wasn't about grief anymore. This was about domination, about control so total it reached inside another person's body. Nero called on his personal physicians, Rome's best, and gave them a command: make Sporus more like Poppea, and they obeyed. We don't have the surgical records, but ancient sources agree. Sporus underwent some form of castration, likely chemical or physical. The goal was to feminize him permanently, not just a dress-up game, a complete, irreversible reshaping of identity. Now think about this. You're a teenage boy. You have no say in what's happening. You're told the emperor, who has the power to kill you with a word, wants to turn you into his dead wife, not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, that he literally wants you to become her, and the entire empire is expected to play along. The procedure was brutal. Roman medicine wasn't known for its gentleness. There were no clean operating rooms, no anesthesia like we know it. You were restrained, physically held down. The tools were primitive. The pain? Unimaginable. The risk of infection or death? Extremely high. But Sporus survived, and when he did, Nero doubled down. He gave him a new name, Sabina, after Poppea. He was moved into the palace, given new quarters, a staff of attendants, a personal wardrobe of elaborate gowns. Jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, using gemstones that had once belonged to the real Poppea. Even the dressing process was part of the performance. Hairstylists curled and pinned his hair into styles fit for Roman nobility. Makeup artists showed him how to accentuate his features, how to use kohl to darken the eyes, rouge to color the cheeks, powder to soften the lines of his face. But this wasn't just about appearance. Nero wanted the performance to be complete. Sporus was taught how to walk like a woman, how to speak like a woman, how to move his hands, sit at a banquet, hold eye contact, but not too much, how to laugh in a way that felt ladylike. Voice coaches trained him to speak higher, softer. His new speech had to match the person he was pretending to be, even though she was dead. And the worst part? He couldn't ever drop the act, not for a second. Nero announced a wedding, a real one. He was going to marry Sporus, now Sabina, in a full imperial ceremony. To be clear, this wasn't some secret backroom affair. This was Rome, the empire. Nero made it official. There were legal documents, witnesses, a palace hall covered in flowers and torchlight, music, feast, celebration. And at the altar stood the most powerful man on earth, pledging eternal love to a surgically altered teenage boy wearing his dead wife's jewelry. To outsiders, the event was surreal, terrifying. Everyone knew what they were watching, but no one could say a word, because this wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration of absolute power. Nero was saying, I can erase a person, I can create a new one, and I can make all of you pretend it's normal. From that point on, Sporus, Sabina, became the Empress of Rome. In title, in function, in presentation, he had his own entourage, his own living quarters, his own income. He rode in litters beside Nero, sat at his side during state dinners, showed up at public events in flowing silks, decked in diamonds, silent and smiling. Every time Nero reminisced about a moment with Poppea, some memory only he had, Sporus Had to play along. He had to smile at the right moments, laugh when Nero joked, cry when he spoke of love that he had to pretend he remembered a life that wasn't his, and Sporus did it perfectly. Ancient sources say he became eerily good at the performance. He could read Nero's moods like a script. He knew when to flatter, when to grieve, when to smile, when to stay quiet. But behind the scenes, he was collapsing. He withdrew, spoke less, smiled less, spent more and more time alone. Because think about what this does to a person. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone he didn't recognize. Every item of clothing, every piece of jewelry, every painted image on the wall whispered, "You're not real. You belong to him." And he was still just a teenager. This bizarre arrangement lasted for more than 2 years. In 67 AD, Nero decided he was going to tour Greece, that he believed he was a brilliant artist and thought the Greeks, famous for their theater and music, would finally appreciate his genius. Naturally, Sporus went with him. The Emperor of Rome traveled with his wife, a former boy slave surgically altered to look like a dead woman. He was introduced to dignitaries, displayed in public, treated as if he were truly Poppaea Sabina. Reborn. It was a pageant of delusion. But back in Rome, trouble was brewing. By 68 AD, Nero had pushed too far. The treasury was bleeding. The Senate had grown restless. Provincial governors, who controlled the legions, were openly rebelling. Even the elite Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, had turned against him. One by one, his allies vanished. When the Senate officially declared him an enemy of the state, Nero fled. And guess who went with him? Sporus, the boy who had become an empress, was now a fugitive, hiding with a man unraveling faster than ever. They holed up in a villa outside Rome with a few loyalists. Nero swung wildly between panic and performance. He planned escape routes, practiced dramatic speeches, drew up suicide scripts like stage plays. But when he finally realized no rescue was coming, he took his own life. It wasn't a heroic end. He reportedly needed help from a servant just to finish the job. But Sporus's nightmare wasn't over. Nero's death left him dangerously exposed. He wasn't just any courtier. He was a walking symbol of Nero's madness. A living, breathing reminder of everything the Roman elite wanted to erase. But he was also a possession, and power-hungry men love trophies. After Nero's death, Sporus became something worse than invisible. He became valuable. Everyone who came into power wanted him, not because they cared about him as a person, but because he was a symbol, a tool, a weird kind of trophy that proved they'd seized control of what Nero once held dearest. First, he was claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, the very same man who helped betray Nero. He kept Sporus around, dressed him up, called him Sabina, just like Nero did. Then, after Sabinus was killed during his own power grab, Sporus passed into the hands of Otho, one of Nero's old allies and, get this, also a former lover of Poppaea. The cycle repeated. He was dressed as a woman, called the Empress, used for appearance. And then came Vitellius. That's when Sporus's life turned from twisted theater into something straight out of a horror show. Vitellius had a plan. He was going to parade Sporus into the public arena and have him reenact the myth of Proserpina, the goddess who was abducted and raped by the god of the underworld. Except this version wasn't metaphorical. Vitellius planned to make Sporus the centerpiece of a violent, humiliating spectacle in the Colosseum. Thousands of spectators, jeering, laughing, watching the emperor's bride be assaulted on stage for entertainment. For Sporus, that wasn't just the end of dignity. That was the end of everything. He had been stripped of his name, his identity, his voice, his body. He'd been used as a plaything, a symbol, a fantasy. And now, they were going to destroy what little remained of him. For laughs. So, Sporus made the only real choice he'd had in years. He ended his own life. Most sources say he used poison. Quiet, alone, off stage. He was probably no more than 20 years old. Think about that. A boy who started life as a palace servant, who was intelligent, educated, and likely full of potential, became a prisoner of identity so warped that death was the only escape. That we'll never know what Sporus dreamed about before Nero noticed him, but we'll never know what kind of man he could have become. Because from the moment Nero decided he looked like Poppaea, Sporus stopped being a person. He became a replacement, a project, a puppet dressed in silks and trauma. And yet, the story lingers, not because it's unique, though it is, but because it forces us to ask a question we're still wrestling with today. What happens when power goes unchecked? History books often focus on emperors and battles, victories and losses, grand architecture and famous decrees. But behind all that, underneath the marble and gold, are stories like Sporus's, stories of people who didn't choose their place in history, but were pulled into it. Used, twisted, forgotten. Most ancient records, Sporus is barely even a person. He's a footnote, a curiosity, the boy-wife of Nero, the tragic effeminate figure of the imperial court. They reduce him to his role, not his reality. But when you look closer, what you find is far more human. You find someone who survived one of the most psychologically disorienting experiences imaginable, who was forced to smile through a nightmare, who maintained composure while living inside a lie so large it filled an empire, and who, when finally faced with complete erasure, chose death as a final act of defiance. In that choice, he took back the only thing he still owned, his will. And here's the truth, that Sporus' story isn't just about Nero's madness. It's about the human cost of unchecked power, about what happens when love becomes obsession, when grief becomes delusion, when people become property. It's about what happens when someone is robbed of agency, over and over again, until there's nothing left to take, except their life. But it's also about resilience, because even though Sporus died young, even though his identity was buried beneath layers of fiction and performance, his story has survived for 2,000 years, and in telling it, in remembering it, we give him something the emperors never could. We give him his humanity back. So if you've made it this far, thank you. Not just for listening to a disturbing chapter of ancient history, but for seeing the human beneath the headline, the person behind the performance, the boy beneath the crown. And if stories like this fascinate you, stories about hidden truths, forgotten lives, and the dark corners of power, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you don't miss what's coming next. Because history isn't just dates and names, it's people, it's pain, it's power. And sometimes, it's a boy named Sporus, forced to live as a ghost, until he finally said no.